So, last week we began the quarter by talking about the crucifixion of Jesus, the death of Jesus on Good Friday. Lindsay did a great job telling that most remarkable of stories. But the thing that makes the story even more remarkable to me is that it's not the last story about Jesus in the Gospels. If I was going to tell you the story of Mahatma Gandhi, if I was going to tell you the story of Mother Teresa, the story of Abraham Lincoln, the story of Alexander the Great, the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, any leader from history, it would end with their death. Now, I might make a few comments about their legacy or about their funeral if something strange happened there, but that would be it. But the point of the story of Jesus, the reason we're so fascinated with his death, is that that's not the last chapter. It doesn't stop with John 19. It goes on to John chapter 20. We believe that Jesus rose from the grave. And it is the very definition of Christianity to have that belief. In fact, one of Jesus' earliest followers, the Apostle Paul, wrote in Romans chapter 10, verses 9 and 10, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with the heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you confess and are saved. In other words, Paul identified two irreducible components for being a Christian. One, you have to publicly profess your faith. You can't be a Christian on the inside alone. If it's not making a difference in your life, if you're not publicly acknowledging Jesus and God, you're not really a Christian. You're not quite there yet in terms of the commitment that God expects. He says, another place in the Bible, if you're ashamed of me before men, I'll be ashamed of you before my Father in heaven. It can't just be an inner belief, it has to be an outer reality. But it can't just be an outer reality. It's got to be rooted in this inner belief. And when Paul is trying to nail down what that belief is, the thing that separates Christianity from everything else, from Islam, from Hinduism, from Sikhism, from everything, he says it's this one belief, that God raised him from the dead. That's a truly remarkable thing, to make the unique qualifier, the unique identifier of your faith. And it's something that many people have a hard time wrapping their brains around for a variety of reasons. And so tonight, I invite you to walk with me back to that first Easter 2,000 years ago, and to observe how people reacted to the news then, and see if perhaps there's some commonalities with what's happening in our hearts here today, so many years later, so many miles away. We're reading through all of John chapter 20. If you have a Bible, you're welcome to read along. Otherwise, I'll have it on the screen up here for you. We're going to start with the story of the greatest disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved, the ideal disciple, John. And it says, John chapter 20, verse 1, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from the scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. John believed on the basis of remarkably little information. Basically, he saw an empty tomb. He saw a hole in the ground, and from that he concluded that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. That was not an immediately obvious conclusion. It was what Mary assumed when she saw the stones rolled away. She thought someone had stolen the body. It wasn't what Peter assumed. Peter was right there with John, next to him. Same data, different conclusion. It says in a parallel passage, Luke 24:12. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying there by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. Peter saw a hole in the ground. John saw a miracle. There are some people like that. People for whom the phrase childlike faith was invented. They have this almost uncanny awareness of God's activity around them. Where you see a coincidence, they see an answered prayer. Where you see a happenstance, they see God's provision. If you're that sort of person tonight, I want you to know two things. First, God is pleased with the simplicity of your faith. And number two, we need you. The rest of us who don't have it that easy, we need you to remind us that we are standing on sacred ground and we need to take off our shoes sometimes. That this is a God-made world. And we too often focus on the wrong things. I think of a story from history. When I think about this type of faith, John's faith, this childlike faith, I think about Francis of Assisi. You may have heard of him, even if you're not a Christian. Francis is one of the most famous followers of Christ of all time. He was sort of unique. He would actually preach to the birds and to the animals and to the fish. And he was just so consumed with God's presence, he wanted to tell everyone how great God was. At one point, he was praying and he felt God speak to him, rebuild my house. So he went and he took some stuff that, he was his father's heir, so he took some of his father's stuff and used it to rebuild this old church that was broken down the edge of town. His father went nuts, brought him home, tied him up. Francis broke out and started doing God's work again. And so finally his father brings him before the bishop and it's like, tell this guy he's nuts, he's got to stop doing this. The whole town's gathered around, it's a big scandal, rich guy's son, going nuts. And Francis says, I won't stop. And so his father says, I disown you. Francis said, fine. And so he stripped all his clothes off because they'd been bought with his father's money. Right in front of the bishop and everybody. Handed his clothes to Dad and walked out naked as a jaybird, believing God would provide. That is childlike faith. And we need people like that in the body of Christ. But we're not all like that. A lot of us have barriers between us and a simple faith in the resurrection, or a simple awareness of God's work around us. So if you're that person, rejoice and be who you are, and be patient with the rest of us. As we read through the rest of the story, we encounter other people that some of us will find more familiar. Starting in verse 10. Then the disciples, Peter and John, went back to their homes. But Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, woman, why are you crying? Pause. Culturally, this is sort of an awkward translation. That was a term of respect then. It sort of sounds insulting now, woman. It was like saying, ma'am, why are you crying? They've taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they've put him. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. Woman, he said, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for? Thinking he was the gardener, she said, sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him. Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. Jesus said, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I'm returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord. And she told them that he said these things to her. Mary had a problem. She was consumed with grief. She was drowning in her own pain, so much so that she could not see Jesus, though he stood in front of her face. She was so blinded by her own needs, by her own past hurts, in this case very fresh. For many of us, things that go back years, maybe a decade or so. Deep pain that prevents us from being aware of the work of God, the presence of God around us in our lives. But Jesus broke through her pain. He broke into the bubble, the shell that she had erected. And how did he do it? He called her name. Mary. He knows your name. He knows your pain. And if there is something that has happened in your past that is keeping you from an awareness of God, perhaps you're a follower of Christ, but because of some devastating blow you suffered, you have a hard time now being aware of God's presence and activity around you. You're someone who's still investigating. You wouldn't say you're a follower of Christ. And one of the things that's holding you back is perhaps past hurts that were done to you by others who claimed the name of Christ, by a religious authority figure, or by a tragedy in your family as a child. He knows your name. He knows your pain, and he's calling if you will hear him. I think of Mary's problem. It reminds me of a man named Sundar Singh. He's not as famous as Francis of Assisi, but just as remarkable. Sundar Singh was a Sikh in India. His mother died at a very young age. At the age of 14, he grew very, very bitter. And his father would send him to the local Christian school because it offered such an excellent education. And he'd get angry as he sat there and listened to these teachers talk about the God who loved and the God who cared, because his mom was dead. And so he would throw things at them. He would insult them. He would organize student protests against them, boycotting of classes. One day, he got so angry, he bought a Bible from them, and then he went home and he ripped it out page by page and threw it into a fire. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you. And he decided to kill himself 3 days later. He was going to throw himself onto the train tracks that ran in front of his house at 5 a.m. the next morning. So all night long, he gave it one last try. He said, God, if you're there, reveal yourself to me now. For 7 hours he prayed. And then all of a sudden, he had a vision. A man appeared to him and said, how long will you deny me? I died for you. I've given my life for you. And he saw hands pierced by nails. And he converted. He became a sadhu, an Indian holy man who traveled around India, telling everyone the good news of Jesus Christ. Because Jesus had broken through his pain. Had not taken away the source of his pain, but had given him the resources he needed to bear up under it. He can do the same for you tonight. Perhaps, though, you don't suffer massive injury. There's another barrier. We move on. In verse 19, on the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, peace, shalom, be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And with that, he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone his sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven. These disciples were not struggling with grief in the same way that Mary was. Instead, they were consumed with their own problems. And they had big problems. They were accomplices of a convicted rebel, an insurrectionist against Caesar, the penalty for which is death. And they know the Romans are willing to dish it out because they just killed their boss. They're in hiding. They're probably trying to figure out a way to get out of town. Now, we know Peter's in the room. Peter, who saw the empty tomb along with John, he walked away wondering what had happened. He had heard from Mary, no, he's alive, I've seen him. But you know what? He doesn't believe yet. Because he's too much buried in what's going on in his life. Like many of us at Stanford, consumed with our problem sets, our papers, our programs, our applications, our activities, our jobs. Maybe we have this notion there's something going on. We've seen hints, rumors of glory around us, hints of the sacred. We'll deal with it next quarter, over break, when I graduate. Jesus shows up in the midst of their preoccupation. To Mary, he spoke her name. To them, he makes a pronouncement. Peace. Peace. You can calm down. I'm here. And in the midst of your schedule here at Stanford, he proclaims peace, shalom, wholeness, health. Think about this story. It reminds me of a man named Chuck Colson. You may have heard of him. He was one of the convicted Watergate conspirators. Conspirators? Back in the day, he had everything going for him. Ivy League grad, cushy job for the president, doing magnificently well in his career. And then, scandal. Every day his name's in the paper. Lies are being told about him. What's worse, truths are being told about him. And he is being crushed under the weight of it. See the writing on the wall? He knows a prison sentence is going to be coming his way soon. His life as he knows it is over. And a friend calls him up, sits him down. And his friend Tom Phillips, the president of Raytheon, says, Chuck, have you thought about Jesus? Not so much. I've been a little busy lately. You may have noticed. Well, Chuck, you should. He can help you with this. Is he going to make things go away? No. But he'll make you more able to bear it. And so they began this dialogue. Tom began to read to Chuck Colson aloud from a book called Mere Christianity. And Chuck was just shocked at what he thought and heard and his responses to it. One day he found himself out in a parking lot, sobbing, crying, God, take my life. take my life. And he did. Chuck Colson went to prison. And he, filled with the love of Christ, he saw the suffering that was there. And he emerged from prison and founded Prison Fellowship. To my knowledge, the largest and most active prison ministry in the world today, helping those who are incarcerated, whether justly or unjustly, to find hope in the midst of very, very troubling circumstances. God spoke peace to Chuck Colson. He spoke peace to disciples. And he can bring peace to you tonight. Some of us have easy faith. Some of us have deep hurts that prevent us from faith. Others are just too preoccupied. But there's a final category. The most famous reaction to that first Easter. That of Thomas. Next verse. Now Thomas, called Didymus, which means twin, one of the 12, was not with the disciples. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Pause. I find this interesting. He thinks they're nuts, but he's still with them a week later. This is not uncommon. You might be here because you think your friends are nuts, but they're nice. That is a very common story throughout history. You hang around with nice people, even though you think they're a little bit off in the head, and you humor them from time to time. Thomas is evidently that sort. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Take your hand, put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said, my Lord and my God. Then Jesus told him, because you've seen me, you will believe. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Thomas, 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 how much of myself I see in you. Thomas is your quintessential skeptic. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If he was alive today, he'd be reading Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris. He'd be boning up on all the arguments against God. He'd know all the reasons not to believe. He might think his Christian friends were nice, but nutty. He wants proof. He doesn't have deep emotional pain. Well, he might, but that's not the problem for him. He's not too busy, although he might be. That's not the real barrier. He needs facts. So what does Jesus give him? Facts that are sufficient for him, are persuasive to him, and are convincing to him. Reminds me of a man I've mentioned already, C.S. Lewis. Professor of philosophy, well, actually professor of English literature at Oxford University, who one term was assigned to teach a load of philosophy as well. And so he began to teach this philosophy course, and as he did so, he was forced to analyze his own beliefs. He was an atheist. He quickly moved to a theist position, decided that atheism was untenable. But he had no desire to be a Christian. In fact, he detested the very thought. He treasured his own autonomy. And the thought that there might be some being somewhere who could tell him yes or no to anything was offensive to him at a moral level. But he was a very logical man. And as he began to research more and more, he found himself being hedged in. In his own words, you must picture me, alone in that room at Magdalene, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted, even for a second, from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of it. And Lewis did the same thing that Thomas did. Did you notice what happened? Once Thomas became convinced, he made a leap that no one else had made yet. My Lord and my God. Mary hadn't seen him. John hadn't seen him. But like many skeptics, He was able to take an idea to its logical conclusion. And once he became convinced of the premises, he chased them as far as they would take him. And he saw that Jesus was not just Lord, but God in the flesh. Incidentally, you ever hear one of your professors or a classmate tell you the Bible never claims that Jesus is God, you now know they're either misinformed or attempting to deceive you. Because it's very clear there. He receives his worship as God, commends Thomas for it, and says others who see it without the same evidence are very blessed. Lewis went on to write several books, the most famous of which is Mere Christianity, which lays out several arguments for the existence of God and for the faith in Jesus Christ. And I strongly commend that book to you. If you're a seeker, if you're a skeptic who really wants to understand, that's a great place to start. I have a copy I'd be happy to loan to you. Probably several of us in this room do. There's other books you can look at. But rather than make you wait for a book, I want to give you just a little thought tonight. I want to plant a seed in your mind. I won't be able to develop it fully. I won't be able to chase down all the nuances. But I want you to see that there are reasons to believe. You see, if you're someone who does not accept the resurrection, you have a challenge. And it may not be obvious to you right now, but it's a very difficult challenge to you. You have to explain what happened on Easter morning 2,000 years ago. You see, right now, over half the Earth's population worships Jesus. And it all goes back to this one event, where a group of people said, we've seen this man whom we saw die, walking around later. And then, as the story goes on, parts I haven't read to you yet, hundreds saw him before he rose. They watched him do physical things. They watched him eat. He cooked breakfast for them. They talked. They interacted. He walked with them along the road. And they became so convinced that they had seen this man, who was definitely dead, alive, that for the next several decades, they went around telling people what they had seen, even though they were reviled, mocked, beaten, tortured to death. Some were beheaded. Some had their skin flayed off. Some were crucified upside down. Some were boiled alive. All save one died for this faith. The other, who did not die for the faith, died in exile. And they had attempted to kill him, but he survived his execution attempt. That would be John, the disciple who Jesus loved. Here's the thing. There's only two other explanations, other than they were telling the truth. Either they were themselves deceived, or that they were deceiving us. If they were deceiving us, if they were lying, well, that's the most remarkable thing I've ever heard. People don't die for what they know to be a lie. I can hear some of you saying, no, people die for lies all the time. That's not what I said. The September 11th hijackers, they died believing Allah would reward them for their bad behavior, for what they consider to be righteous behavior, right? I would say that's a lie, but they died for it. You see, but they died for it because they didn't think it was a lie. They were convinced it was true. That's not parallel to these 12 at all. What they were saying is, I saw Jesus. I touched him. Heck, I poked him. I had breakfast with him. I know this happened. And you're about to torture me to death. But I'm going to tell you it happened nonetheless. That doesn't happen. One person doesn't do that, much less 12, who each have several opportunities to recant. So maybe they themselves were deceived. Maybe it was some sort of a hallucination. Well, again, tall order. I mean, what sort of hallucination occurs over a period of 40 days in at least 4 or 5 different locations to different groups of people who are in different emotional states, who are already thinking this may not be something visible. This may not be something physical, rather. Maybe I'm seeing a ghost or something in my mind. And so they're doing things like poking him and like making him move things around so they can see them. And then saying later, no, that which we have seen, that which we have touched, that which we have heard, this we proclaim to you concerning the word of life. Either they were deceiving us, they were themselves deceived, or they were telling the truth. And I would submit to you and humbly, please hear this. The only serious reason I can think of for rejecting the assertion of the resurrection is an a priori assumption on your part that miracles cannot happen. There is no God. There are no miracles. I humbly submit to you that is intellectually dishonest, because that is the very subject under consideration. And to assume it is false from the outset is to not even enter into a serious intellectual search at all. If you are interested, I'd be happy to talk to you later one-on-one, or I commend that book to you, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, which many of us have copies of and we'll be happy to loan. There's others, The Case for Christ, too. Start wherever your intellectual interest takes you. The point is, if you're the sort of person who needs facts, logic, and argument are there for you. Reactions to the resurrection range from simple childlike faith to emotional pain to distracted busyness to outright skepticism. I bet each of us can identify with at least one of those first hearers of the gospel story tonight. Whether you're a follower of Christ and have been for many years, or you're still checking it out, you probably heard something that resonated with your heart. So to recap, if you've got that simple childlike faith, cherish it and keep it. It's a gift. And it's a gift not just to you, but to the rest of us who need to be encouraged by it from time to time. Remind us that there is glory all around. If you've got pain, hurt, that is holding you back, He's speaking to you. And He will heal your pain. And just as He did with Mary, she wanted to stay there with Him. She wanted to cling on. And He said, don't hold on to me. Instead, I have a mission for you. Go to the others who hurt and tell them the good news. He redirected her focus from herself to a needy world. The disciples who were so busy and consumed with their own problems, He said, peace. Receive His peace tonight. And as He did with them, He will give you a mission to go out to others who are distracted and busy and who need God's peace. He sends you as an ambassador. Receive the Holy Spirit and go with His anointing. Or you're a skeptic and you need proof, then I invite you to pray a simple prayer with me tonight. God, reveal yourself to me in a way that is meaningful and persuasive to me. If you pray that prayer and you mean it, you will be surprised at what happens. God, reveal yourself to me, if you're there, in a way that is meaningful and persuasive to me. And I encourage you to begin your intellectual journey tonight. We come full circle. We began by talking about Paul's identification of this belief as the very essence, the heart of Christianity. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you confess and are saved. We're going to close in prayer and then some worship. And as we worship, I invite you to confess joyfully that Jesus is Lord, and to sing the songs that we sing from a pure and authentic heart, and mean the words. And to not just mean it here, when you go out into campus, in your dorm room, in the cafeteria, in your classes. Freely confess that Jesus is Lord.